Claire Bennett's flight landed 2 hours ahead of schedule, and that single, ordinary stroke of luck was about to save her daughter's future. She didn't call ahead. She wanted to surprise her husband, wanted to walk into the nursery and scoop up her 6-month-old, Sophie, before nap time ended. She had no idea that the moment she opened that nursery door, she would step into the middle of a conversation that was never supposed to reach her ears. A conversation that would reveal her own mother-in-law, and the nanny she trusted with her child had spent the last 4 months building a case to take that child away from her forever. She stood frozen in the doorway, one hand still on the frame, and heard her mother-in-law say 5 words that would replay in her mind for the rest of her life. She'll never even know. What Claire didn't know yet was how long this had been planned, how many people were involved, or how close they already were to succeeding. She only knew, standing there in the soft afternoon light of her daughter's nursery, that the 2 women she trusted most outside her marriage had been lying to her for months, and she was about to find out exactly how far they were willing to go. To understand what Claire walked into that afternoon, you have to understand who Claire Bennett actually was, because almost nobody in her husband's family had bothered to find out. Claire had married into money. Not her own, her husband Derek's. The Bennett family had built a chain of boutique hotels across the Pacific Northwest over 3 generations, a business empire currently overseen by Derek's mother, Regina Bennett, a woman whose warmth in public was matched only by the coldness she reserved for anyone she considered a threat to the family's control. Claire had met Derek at a design conference 5 years earlier. She was an interior architect with her own small but respected firm, independent, capable, entirely uninterested in the Bennett fortune. That, ironically, was exactly what made Regina distrust her from the very beginning. A woman who didn't seem to want the money was, in Regina's experience, either lying or planning something worse. For the first 3 years of the marriage, Regina kept a polite, watchful distance, testing Claire the way a customs officer inspects luggage, methodically, patiently, looking for the seam that didn't quite match. Claire passed every test without knowing she was being tested at all. She worked hard. She loved Derek fiercely. She never once asked for anything from the family fortune. Then Sophie was born, and everything changed. Under the terms of the Bennett Family Trust, a decades-old document drafted by Derek's grandfather, any child born into the family automatically inherited a protected share of company stock upon birth, held by a guardian until the child turned 25. For every grandchild before Sophie, that guardian had always been the parents. But there was a clause, a narrow, rarely used clause that Claire had never read, tucked into page 41 of a document she'd signed almost as an afterthought during her wedding preparations, back when she was in love and had no reason to imagine she'd ever need to defend herself against her own family. The clause stated that if either biological parent were found unfit, incapacitated, or a demonstrable risk to the child's well-being, guardianship of the child's trust would revert not to the surviving parent, but to the senior-most family matriarch, Regina Bennett. Nobody had ever needed to use that clause in 3 generations. Until Regina decided Claire's independence, her career, her refusal to hand her daughter over to the traditional Bennett family nanny structure, made her exactly the kind of unfit mother the clause was designed to remove. She just needed proof. For months after Sophie was born, Regina had generously arranged for a nanny to help Claire through the exhausting first year. A soft-spoken, endlessly capable woman named Ingrid Fisher, who came recommended, Regina said, by the best families in the city. Claire had been hesitant. She wanted to raise Sophie herself, wanted the early months to be hers and Derek's alone. But Derek, exhausted from work and eager to keep peace with his mother, gently pushed her toward accepting the help. It's just support, Claire. Everyone uses help. It doesn't make you a bad mother. Claire agreed, reluctantly, telling herself it was temporary. She had no idea that Ingrid Fisher had been placed in her home for one purpose only, to document, quietly and methodically, every moment that could later be twisted into evidence of neglect. Ingrid was good at her job. Too good. She never openly criticized Claire. She simply asked careful, seemingly innocent questions that Claire now realizes, looking back, were designed to be repeated later out of context. Do you usually let her cry it out that long? Is it normal for you to work through her nap time? Does Derek know you skipped her doctor's appointment last week for a client meeting? Each question, alone, seemed like nothing. A nanny getting to know a new mother's routine. But Ingrid wasn't just asking. She was recording. Every day, she typed a private log on her personal laptop, cataloging Claire's parenting decisions with a clinical, damning precision, framing ordinary working mother compromises as patterns of neglect, framing Claire's independence as instability, framing every normal moment of exhausted new parent imperfection as proof of a mother who couldn't be trusted. And every week, without Claire's knowledge, Ingrid drove that log across town to Regina Bennett's private office, where the two women reviewed it together over tea, refining their narrative, building their file. Claire began to sense something was wrong nearly 2 months before the day she came home early. Not through any single dramatic moment, but through a slow accumulation of small, disorienting details that didn't quite add up. Sophie's baby monitor app, which Claire checked obsessively from her phone during work trips, started showing gaps. 10 minutes here, 20 minutes there. Moments where the feed simply cut out, always during the exact windows when Claire wasn't home to notice in real time. When she asked Ingrid about it, the nanny smiled her calm, practiced smile. Wi-Fi glitches, probably. Old house, thick walls. I'll have Derek look at the router. Derek, distracted and eager to avoid conflict, never got around to it. Then there were the doctor's appointments. Claire distinctly remembered scheduling Sophie's 4-month checkup for a Tuesday afternoon. When she tried to confirm the time with the pediatrician's office, the receptionist informed her, with obvious confusion, that the appointment had already happened. The previous Thursday, with Regina Bennett listed as the accompanying guardian. I didn't authorize that, Claire said slowly, a cold unease settling into her chest. Mrs. Bennett said there'd been a scheduling mix-up, the receptionist explained. She had the proper authorization forms. Signed by you, actually. Claire had signed no such forms. She just hadn't yet understood that somewhere in the pile of paperwork Regina had asked her to sign, for insurance purposes, during Sophie's birth, buried among dozens of routine hospital documents, sat a standing medical authorization giving Regina emergency access to Sophie's care. An authorization Claire had no memory of specifically approving, because she'd been recovering from an emergency C-section, and signing whatever was placed gently in front of her. She started paying closer attention after that. She started noticing the way Regina's visits, once occasional, had become suspiciously frequent, always timed for the hours Claire was traveling for work. She started noticing the way Ingrid's questions had shifted from curious to almost clinical. The way she'd begun subtly steering conversations toward Claire's work stress, her sleep schedule, her occasional short temper during long nights. Something was being built around her. She just didn't yet know what, or how far it had already progressed. 3 weeks before that fateful afternoon, Claire flew to Seattle for a 4-day design conference. The kind of professional trip she'd taken dozens of times before Sophie was born, and had scaled back significantly since. This one, though, was important. A potential client worth 7 figures to her firm was flying in specifically to meet her. Derek encouraged her to go. You've earned this, Claire. Sophie's in good hands. Go rebuild your career. You deserve it. Claire almost didn't go. Something in her gut told her to stay home. An instinct she couldn't quite name and told herself was just new mother anxiety. She went anyway, promising herself she'd video call every night. The calls, when they happened, felt strange. Ingrid always seemed to have Sophie asleep already by the time Claire called. Always had some gentle, plausible excuse. She had a big day. Wore herself right out. Regina, who Claire discovered was staying at the house to help out during her absence, hovered just off camera during every call, occasionally interjecting comments that made Claire feel, without being able to articulate why, like an outsider checking in on her own child rather than her mother. On the 3rd night, the video call dropped entirely. When Claire tried calling back, no one answered for nearly 2 hours. When Ingrid finally picked up, she apologized breezily. Sorry, we were in the middle of bath time. Everything's fine. Claire didn't sleep that night. She sat in her hotel room staring at the ceiling, replaying the last 2 months in her mind. The monitor gaps, the mysterious doctor's appointment, the strange authorization forms, the growing sense that the house she'd left behind wasn't quite the house she'd returned to. She flew home a day early. That decision, small, instinctive, unplanned, was the single thread that would unravel everything. Claire's rideshare pulled into the driveway just after 2 in the afternoon. The house was quiet. Derek's car wasn't there. He was still at the office, unaware she'd come home ahead of schedule. She let herself in through the side door, dropped her suitcase in the hallway, and moved instinctively toward the nursery. Drawn by an ache in her chest she hadn't fully admitted to herself until that exact moment. She had missed her daughter with a physical, bone-deep hunger that 4 days of phone calls hadn't come close to satisfying. She reached the nursery door, slightly ajar, and heard voices inside before she saw anything. Regina's voice, low and businesslike. Ingrid's voice, quieter, almost hesitant. Claire paused, her hand on the doorframe, some instinct keeping her from announcing herself immediately. 3 more entries this week, Ingrid was saying. The missed nap on Tuesday, the argument with Derek she doesn't know I heard, and the appointment she forgot about last month. That should be enough to submit to the attorney. It needs to be airtight, Regina replied. The moment we file for guardianship, she's going to fight it. Every gap in the record, every excuse she has, we need to have already closed it off. I want the judge to look at this file and see a woman who was never fit to raise that child in the first place. Claire's blood went cold. She stood absolutely still, barely breathing, one hand pressed flat against the wall to steady herself. What about Derek? Ingrid asked. He's not going to just stand by and let you take his daughter from her mother. Derek doesn't need to know the full plan, Regina said, and there was something almost bored in her tone, the casual cruelty of a woman discussing a business acquisition. He just needs to believe his wife has been struggling, overwhelmed, maybe even unstable. By the time this reaches a courtroom, he'll be relieved someone else stepped in to help. He won't fight me. He never does. And Claire? Claire, Regina said, and Claire heard something shift in her mother-in-law's voice, something almost satisfied. Will never even know what hit her. She'll think she failed as a mother. She'll blame herself. And by the time she realizes what actually happened, Sophie's trust, and her guardianship, will already belong to me. Claire's hand was shaking against the doorframe. She looked through the gap in the door and saw them both standing over Sophie's changing table. A laptop open between them. A manila folder thick with printed pages sitting beside it. Her daughter's medical bracelet, still on her tiny wrist from a checkup Claire hadn't authorized, was clearly visible in a photograph pinned to the top of the file. She'll never even know. The words landed like a blow to the chest. Claire pushed the door open. Both women turned at the sound of the door. For one frozen second nobody spoke. Ingrid's face went white. Regina's expression, remarkably, barely changed at all. The composed, practiced mask of a woman who had spent decades learning never to let her face betray her thinking. Claire, Regina said smoothly, closing the laptop with unhurried precision. You're home early. What a surprise. Every instinct in Claire's body screamed at her to grab her daughter, to scream, to demand answers immediately. But some deeper, colder instinct, the same one that had told her to come home a day early, held her still. If she exploded now, she realized, she would hand Regina exactly the evidence she needed. An unstable, hysterical mother, screaming in front of her infant daughter, confirming every word in that manila folder. That was precisely the reaction Regina was counting on. Claire took a breath she didn't know she had in her, and forced her voice into something calm, almost pleasant. I got an early flight, she said. I wanted to surprise everyone. She walked to the crib, lifted Sophie gently into her arms, and pressed a kiss to her daughter's forehead, feeling her heartbeat slow slightly at the familiar warmth. Sophie stirred, blinked up at her and smiled, a small unknowing anchor in the middle of the storm quietly detonating around her. Well, Regina said, gathering the folder with deliberate casualness, tucking it under her arm as though it were nothing more than paperwork. I should get going. I just came by to help Ingrid with a few things while you were away. Of course, Claire said. Thank you for helping out. She watched Regina leave, watched Ingrid gather her things with visibly shaking hands, and stood alone in the nursery holding her daughter, her mind racing through everything she'd just heard. They didn't know she'd heard everything. They thought they'd simply been caught mid-conversation, nothing more. That misunderstanding, Claire realized as her pulse steadied, was the only advantage she had left. She wasn't going to waste it. That night, after Sophie was asleep and Derek came home exhausted and oblivious from work, Claire made a decision that terrified her more than anything Regina had planned. She decided not to tell him yet. Not because she doubted his love. She didn't. But she remembered Regina's words with painful clarity. He won't fight me, he never does. And she needed to know, with absolute certainty, whether that was true before she staked her daughter's future on it. Instead, she called the one person she trusted completely. Her college roommate, Priya Anand, now a family law attorney with a reputation for dismantling exactly this kind of quiet, well-funded manipulation. Tell me everything, Priya said. From the beginning. Don't leave anything out, even the small stuff. Especially the small stuff. Claire talked for nearly 2 hours. The monitor gaps. The unauthorized doctor's appointment. The strange form she'd signed in the hospital. The overheard conversation, word for word, as precisely as she could remember it. This is calculated, Priya said finally, her voice grim. This isn't a worried grandmother overstepping. This is a coordinated campaign, and it sounds like it's been building for months. We need documentation. Real documentation, not just what you remember hearing. Do you have access to that laptop? The file they were building? No, Claire admitted. It's Regina's personal laptop. I've never even seen it before today. Then we need another way in. Claire, listen to me carefully. From this point forward, you cannot let them know you know. Not a word, not a look. If they realize you overheard that conversation, they'll destroy the file and build a new one, more careful, harder to catch. You need to give them exactly what they expect to see. A tired, slightly overwhelmed mother, nothing more. Meanwhile, we document everything on our end. Claire closed her eyes, feeling the familiar ache of exhaustion settle deeper into her bones. How long? As long as it takes to make this airtight in our favor instead of theirs. The weeks that followed were the strangest, most exhausting performance of Claire's life. She smiled at Regina during Sunday dinners. She thanked Ingrid for her help with Sophie's routine. She played, convincingly, the role of a grateful, slightly overwhelmed new mother who suspected nothing at all. Behind the scenes, with Priya's guidance, she began building a case of her own. She started keeping a private, time-stamped journal, not of Sophie's routine, but of every interaction with Regina and Ingrid, documented immediately after it happened, backed up in triplicate to a cloud account neither woman knew existed. She reviewed the Monitor app's technical logs with a cybersecurity consultant Priya recommended, who confirmed within days that the Wi-Fi glitches weren't glitches at all. Someone had been manually disabling the feed during specific windows, likely to prevent Claire from seeing something happening in the nursery she wasn't meant to witness. That detail chilled Claire more than anything else. What exactly had they been hiding from the Monitor? The answer came from an unexpected source. Sophie's pediatrician, contacted quietly by Priya's investigator, confirmed something Claire had never been told. That during the unauthorized appointment Regina had taken Sophie to, she'd specifically requested an evaluation for developmental delays and signs of neglect. A request the pediatrician had found strange enough to flag in her private notes, since nothing in Sophie's actual examination supported any such concern. Regina hadn't just been documenting ordinary parenting imperfections. She'd been trying deliberately to manufacture medical evidence that didn't exist. She's building a paper trail from nothing, Priya said, reviewing the pediatrician's notes with barely contained anger. This isn't concern, Claire. This is fabrication. And fabricating medical records to support a custody claim isn't just unethical. Depending on how it's used, it could be criminal. Claire felt something harden inside her that had, until that moment, still been holding out a small, foolish hope that this was all some enormous misunderstanding. It wasn't. It had never been. 3 weeks into the investigation, something unexpected happened. Something that would change the entire shape of Claire's case. Ingrid Fisher showed up at Claire's door on a Tuesday evening, alone, without warning, her composed nanny's demeanor completely gone. Her eyes were red, her hands trembling as she stood on the porch, glancing nervously over her shoulder as though afraid of being followed. I need to talk to you, Ingrid said. Please. It's about Regina. Claire's instinct was distrust, sharp and immediate. But something in Ingrid's face, a genuine unguarded fear, made her step back and let the woman inside. What followed was a confession Claire hadn't expected. Ingrid explained in halting, guilty sentences that this wasn't her first placement like this. Regina had paid her generously through a private consulting arrangement that never appeared on any official nanny agency paperwork, specifically to document and, when necessary, subtly manufacture evidence of parental unfitness. It had happened once before, Ingrid admitted, with a different family, a different grandmother, a similar custody dispute over trust assets. I told myself it was just documentation, Ingrid said, tears streaking down her face. I told myself I was just being thorough. But last week she asked me to start giving Sophie a mild sedative during the day, disguised as a vitamin supplement, so she'd seem lethargic and unresponsive during a supervised visit with the trust's family attorney. I said no. I couldn't do that to a baby. That's when I realized how far she was actually willing to go. Claire's stomach turned violently. She thought of every strange nap, every unexplained fussiness, every moment she'd blamed on teething or growth spurts, and felt sick wondering how much of it had actually been real. Will you testify to that? Claire asked, her voice barely steady. Everything you just told me? Ingrid nodded, wiping her eyes. I should have said something months ago. I let myself believe it wasn't my responsibility to interfere in a family's business. I was wrong. I'm so sorry, Claire. I'll tell your attorney everything. For the first time since that afternoon in the nursery, Claire allowed herself to feel something close to hope. With Ingrid's testimony secured and the pediatrician's notes documented, Priya advised Claire it was finally time to bring Derek into the picture. Carefully, with evidence in hand, before Regina had any chance to get to him first with her own version of events, Claire sat her husband down on a quiet Saturday morning, Sophie napping upstairs, and laid out everything. The overheard conversation, the manufactured medical concerns, Ingrid's confession about the sedative request, the guardianship clause buried in the trust document Claire had signed years earlier without truly understanding it. Derek's reaction wasn't what Claire feared. He didn't defend his mother. He didn't accuse Claire of overreacting. Instead, she watched something in his face slowly fracture as the pieces came together. The strange appointment he'd vaguely known about but never questioned, the monitor glitches he'd meant to fix but never had, the growing frequency of his mother's visits that he'd simply written off as grandmotherly enthusiasm. She told me you were struggling, he said quietly, staring at the documents spread across the table. She said you'd asked her for extra help, that you didn't want me to worry about it. I believed her because I didn't want to believe anything else. I never asked her for that, Claire said gently. Derek, she was building a case to take Sophie from both of us. Not just me. You were never supposed to fight this, remember? She was counting on that. Derek sat in silence for a long moment, his jaw tight, his hands clenched on the table. When he finally spoke, his voice had a hardness Claire had rarely heard from him. She's not touching our daughter, he said. Whatever this takes, Claire, I'm with you completely. For the first time in 3 months, Claire let herself cry. Not from fear this time, but from the sheer relief of no longer carrying this alone. With Derek fully informed and committed, Priya moved quickly to formalize the case, filing a preemptive petition that did something Regina had never anticipated. It flipped the entire legal framework of her own scheme back against her. Rather than waiting for Regina to file her guardianship claim, Claire and Derek's legal team filed first, requesting a formal court review of the trust's guardianship clause itself, along with a request for sanctions against Regina for what the petition explicitly termed a documented pattern of fabricated evidence and attempted medical falsification intended to secure custody through fraudulent means. Regina, blindsided, arrived at the courthouse with her own attorney, clearly expecting to control the narrative the way she'd controlled every room she'd ever walked into. That confidence lasted exactly as long as it took Priya to present her evidence. The technical report on the manipulated baby monitor. The pediatrician's notes documenting a request for a non-existent developmental concern. The forged authorization signature, confirmed by a handwriting analyst to be inconsistent with Claire's genuine signature in 7 separate identifiable ways. And finally, Ingrid Fisher, called to the stand, testifying in careful, precise detail about her paid role in the scheme, about the previous family Regina had targeted years earlier, and about the specific request to sedate an infant to manufacture the appearance of neglect during a supervised visit. Regina's composed mask, the one she'd worn flawlessly for decades, finally cracked in the middle of that courtroom. "This is a family matter," she said sharply, cutting off her own attorney's attempts to object. "I was protecting my granddaughter. I was protecting this family's legacy." "You were protecting your control over it," Claire said quietly, the first words she'd spoken directly to her mother-in-law since that afternoon in the nursery. "Sophie was never in danger from me, Regina. She was in danger from you." The judge, a sharp-eyed woman with little patience for family theatrics, was unmoved by Regina's attempts to reframe the narrative. "The evidence presented here doesn't describe a concerned grandmother," she said. "It describes a deliberate, sustained campaign of fraud against the child's own mother, using the child's medical care as a tool. This court finds the guardianship clause as invoked to be entirely without merit, and refers the matter of falsified medical documentation to the district attorney's office for further review." Regina's guardianship petition was dismissed outright. Within weeks, the district attorney's office opened a formal investigation into the falsified pediatric records, a case that would eventually result in Regina pleading guilty to a reduced charge of fraudulent documentation in exchange for probation and mandatory removal from any formal role in the family trust's guardianship provisions. A humiliating, permanent severing from the very control she'd spent decades protecting. The fallout extended further than the courtroom. Word of the scandal moved quietly but decisively through the Bennett family's social circle. The kind of story that couldn't be fully suppressed no matter how much money and reputation Regina still had left. The hotel board, already uneasy about the pending fraud investigation, voted to remove her from her position as CEO within the year, installing Derek, reluctantly, and only after Claire encouraged him to step up, as the company's new leadership. Ingrid Fisher, in a resolution that surprised nearly everyone, was never prosecuted. Her cooperation, combined with the fact that she'd ultimately refused Regina's most dangerous request, and come forward voluntarily, was enough for the district attorney to decline charges. She left the childcare industry entirely, unable to forgive herself for how long she'd participated before finally drawing a line. Claire, to her own surprise, didn't hold on to anger toward her. She understood, in a way she hadn't expected to, that fear and complicity could look remarkably similar from the outside, and that the moment Ingrid finally chose courage over convenience had mattered enormously. Regina, stripped of her company role and facing a permanent, humiliating asterisk on a reputation she'd spent a lifetime building, retreated from public life almost entirely. She sent one letter to Claire months later, that Claire read once, calmly, and then placed in a drawer without responding. It offered no genuine apology, only a quiet, self-justifying explanation about wanting to protect what she'd built. Claire didn't need to answer it. The court already had. A year after that ordinary, extraordinary afternoon when Claire's flight landed 2 hours early, she stood in Sophie's newly redesigned nursery, the same room where everything had nearly been taken from her, watching her daughter, now walking unsteadily between pieces of furniture, laugh at nothing in particular the way only a happy, healthy toddler can. Derek stood beside her, his arm around her shoulders, watching the same small, ordinary miracle. "Do you ever think about what would have happened?" he asked quietly. "If your flight hadn't landed early that day?" Claire considered the question for a long moment, watching Sophie stumble happily toward the toy chest in the corner. "I try not to," she admitted. "But I think about what I want her to know someday, when she's old enough to understand any of this. That the people who are supposed to protect you sometimes aren't the ones who love you the most. And that the ones who actually do love you will fight for you. Even when it's hard. Even when it means standing against people you never expected to become a threat." She thought, too, about the version of herself who had stood frozen in that doorway, hand pressed against the frame, forcing herself not to scream. She hadn't known in that moment whether she had the strength to fight quietly, patiently, methodically, against people with far more money and far more practice at manipulation than she had. She'd found out she did. Sophie toddled over, arms raised, and Claire lifted her daughter into her arms, feeling the same steady, grounding warmth she'd felt that afternoon in the nursery. holding her through the worst moment of her life without letting her see even a flicker of the fear underneath. She had come home 2 hours early that day, on nothing more than instinct. It was the single most important 2 hours of her life. And her daughter's future had depended entirely on her willingness to trust that quiet, unexplainable feeling that something wasn't right, and to walk through that door anyway.